There are things you know without being able to explain how you know them. I've lived long enough to understand that. 63 years on this earth, 31 of them as a contractor, and I've learned to trust the feeling in my gut the same way I trust the feeling in my hands when a wall doesn't sit right. You can't always see the crack, but you feel it. Something is wrong. Something is off. And no matter how many times people tell you you're imagining things you know, that was the feeling I had when my daughter-in-law stopped answering her phone. I should back up. My son deployed 8 months ago. He's Army. Has been for 12 years. And I'm proud of him in the way that fathers are proud when their children choose something harder than what's comfortable. But proud doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean I don't lie awake some nights. It doesn't mean I don't reach for the phone every time the news shows something happening somewhere overseas. He has 2 kids. My grandchildren. Tyler, who just turned 10 in March, and Emma, who is 7 and who has her grandmother's eyes, even though my wife passed 4 years ago. Emma has those same gray-green eyes, that same way of tilting her head when she's thinking, and every time I look at her I feel both the loss and the gift of it simultaneously. My son and his wife separated 14 months ago. The divorce finalized 6 months after that. I won't say much about Rebecca because what I think of her now would color everything I'm about to tell you, and I want you to come to your own conclusions. What I will say is that the divorce was not peaceful. My son fought hard for more time with his children. He got every other weekend before the deployment, plus Wednesday evenings. The agreement was that while he was overseas, I would have his time. I would pick the kids up every other weekend, take them for Wednesday dinners, be the consistent presence in their lives while their father was somewhere I couldn't find on a map without looking it up first. For the first 4 months, it worked well enough. Rebecca and I had never been close, but we were civil. She would have the kids ready. I would pull into the driveway. She would bring them out. We would exchange a few words, nothing warm, and I would take my grandchildren for the weekend and try to give them something steady when everything else in their small lives was shifting. Tyler is old enough to carry his feelings quietly, the way boys that age sometimes do. He would sit in the passenger seat and talk about baseball or ask questions about whatever project I was working on, and I could see him choosing, consciously, not to be sad. Emma would sing in the back seat. Emma always sang. In month 5, Rebecca introduced a man named Craig. She didn't introduce him to me directly. Tyler mentioned him, the way kids mention things, sideways and without fanfare, in the middle of talking about something else. Craig made pancakes this morning. Craig has a truck like yours, but red. I noted it. I didn't say anything. It wasn't my business, I told myself. She was a divorced woman. She was allowed to move on. In month 6, I noticed Emma wasn't singing. It happened gradually, the way these things do, so that you don't catch it as a single moment, but as an accumulation of small things that you keep dismissing individually until one day you can't dismiss them anymore. Emma stopped singing in the car. Then she stopped asking to stop at the gas station for a Sprite, which had been our thing since she was 4 years old. Then she stopped running to the car when I pulled in. Rebecca would bring her out, holding her hand, and Emma would climb into the back seat and buckle herself in and look out the window, and I would catch her eyes in the rearview mirror and she would look away. I told myself she was adjusting. 7 is a hard age for upheaval. I told myself I was projecting, that I was a 63-year-old man reading too much into the quiet moods of a little girl. I told myself a lot of things. What I couldn't explain away was the Sunday calls. Emma and I had a tradition. Every Sunday evening, around 6 o'clock, she would call me from Rebecca's phone. We had been doing it since my son deployed. Since Emma decided that if she couldn't call her dad, she would call me instead. She would tell me about her week. She would ask me things, big questions, the kind 7-year-olds ask out of nowhere. Grandpa, do you think fish know when it's raining? Things like that. I lived for those calls. 6 weeks before everything happened, the Sunday calls stopped. First week, I thought she'd simply forgotten or was busy. Second week, I texted Rebecca and got back a one-line reply. She's tired. Talk next week. Third week, nothing. I called. It went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I texted. No response until the next morning, a single message. Everything is fine. She's going through a phase. Give her space. Give her space. Those words sat in my chest like a stone. I talked to my son's attorney. I was told that without evidence of harm, there wasn't much to do. Rebecca had legal custody. Emma, not wanting to call her grandfather, wasn't grounds for anything. I was told to document, to keep records, to wait and see. I documented, I kept records. I waited. I saw nothing I could prove. And then, on a Thursday evening, I got a text from Rebecca that I still have saved on my phone. I've read it probably 100 times since. It said, I need you to come Sunday at 2 p.m. sharp to pick up some of Derek's boxes from the garage. If you're not here by 2, I'm donating everything. This is the only time I'm offering. Now, my son didn't have boxes at Rebecca's house. He'd moved his things out before the deployment, put everything in a storage unit I was paying for monthly. I knew this because I helped him move every single box. Whatever was in that garage was not Derek's. But that wasn't what stopped me cold. What stopped me was the phrase, only time I'm offering. Rebecca and I had never had a conversation about any boxes. There was no prior offer. This was not a follow-up. This came from nowhere, and something about the way it was worded, the precision of it, the 2 p.m. sharp, the threat attached, felt less like a message about boxes and more like a message designed to control exactly when I would and would not be at that house. I didn't sleep Thursday night. I lay in bed and I thought about Emma's gray-green eyes looking away from mine in the rearview mirror. I thought about 6 weeks without a Sunday call. I thought about Tyler, who had been quieter than usual on our last visit, who had asked me halfway through Saturday dinner, apropos of nothing, whether I thought his dad would be home soon. And I had said I hoped so, and Tyler had nodded and gone back to his food, and something in his expression had looked less like a 10-year-old and more like someone carrying something he didn't know how to put down. Friday morning I drove past Rebecca's house. I don't know exactly what I was looking for. I just needed to see it. The house looked normal from the outside. Lights off, both cars in the driveway. Normal. I drove home and sat at my kitchen table and tried to talk myself out of what I was feeling. I couldn't. Saturday evening at 9:30, I drove to Rebecca's house. I want to be clear about why I went the night before instead of Sunday at 2. It wasn't anger. It wasn't a power play. It was the same gut feeling I described at the beginning. The feeling that something is wrong even when you can't see the crack. I have lived 63 years with that feeling, and every time I ignored it, I regretted it. I decided I was done ignoring it. The house was lit up. I could see the glow of the television through the front window. I could hear music, something with bass, playing from inside. I parked 2 houses down because I didn't want to announce myself, which in retrospect was either smart or paranoid depending on how you look at it. I sat in my truck for about 5 minutes, then I heard something. At first I thought it was a cat, that high wavering sound that carries at night when everything else is quiet. But it was coming from the side of the house, near the detached garage. And it didn't stop and it didn't move the way a cat would move. It stayed in one place, and after a few seconds I realized it wasn't an animal at all. It was a child crying. I was out of my truck before I'd made a conscious decision to move. The garage was separated from the house by maybe 30 feet. There was a side door, one of those old wooden doors with a slide bolt on the outside. And the sound, that thin, exhausted crying, was coming from behind it. My hands were shaking when I threw the bolt. The door swung open, and the smell hit me first. The smell of a closed space that hadn't had fresh air in too long. And then my eyes adjusted to the dark, and I saw Tyler sitting on the concrete floor next to an old workbench. His wrists zip-tied to one of the legs, his knees pulled to his chest. He looked up at me, and for a moment he just stared, like he wasn't sure I was real. "Grandpa." His voice was so small. I was on my knees beside him before the word finished leaving his mouth. I had a utility knife on my keychain, the one I've carried for 30 years, and I had his wrists free in seconds. He fell against me and I held him and I said his name and I said I was here and I said it was going to be okay. And I was saying it as much for myself as for him because my heart was doing something I could not afford to let it do. Not yet. How long have you been in here? I asked him. Since this morning, he said. Because I talked back. I held him tighter. I breathed. I asked him if he was hurt, and he said no, just his wrists. And I looked at his wrists in the thin light coming through the door and saw the red lines where the zip ties had been. I photographed them immediately. I don't know exactly when I made the decision to document everything before I did anything else, but I did, and I am grateful for it now. I asked Tyler if he could walk. He said yes. But then he grabbed my arm and he said, "Grandpa, wait. You have to know something first. Before we go inside." I looked at him. 10 years old, sitting on a garage floor, red marks on his wrists, and his eyes were doing the same thing Emma's had been doing in my rearview mirror, looking at something I couldn't see, carrying something too heavy for someone his age. He said, "Emma's in the attic." I went still. He said, "She's been up there since Tuesday." Craig said she had to learn her lesson. He said 3 days minimum this time. This time? 2 words. This time. I heard them, and I understood in an instant what they meant and what they implied, and I understood that whatever I thought I knew about what had been happening in this house, I had understood nothing. I asked him if Emma was okay, and he said he thought so. He had been sneaking crackers and a water bottle up to her through the pull-down stairs when Rebecca and Craig were out, but they'd caught him doing it this morning, and that was why he was in the garage. He said Emma knew not to make noise during the day because Craig would check, and if he heard her crying, he'd take away the blanket. I stood up. I told Tyler to stay by the garage door and not to move. I told him I would be back in 2 minutes. I took out my phone and I was dialing 911 before I had taken 3 steps toward the house. I gave the dispatcher the address. I told her what I'd found. I told her there was a child in the attic and a child in the garage and 2 adults inside the house who did not know I was there. She told me to stay on the line and to stay outside and to not go into the house and to wait for officers who were already being dispatched. I want to tell you I stayed outside. I want to tell you I waited calmly by the garage with Tyler and watched the street for police lights. But I need you to understand something. Emma had been in that attic since Tuesday. It was Saturday night. That was 4 days. 4 days in an attic in a house where the heat had been running all week. And I am a grandfather before I am anything else. I told the dispatcher I was going in for the child. She told me not to. I went anyway. The attic access was in the hallway outside the 2 kids' bedrooms. I'd seen it 100 times over the years. One of those pull-down stair panels in the ceiling. I remember thinking when my son and Rebecca first bought the house that the pull cord was too high for a small child to reach. The cord was tied off now, knotted around the hallway doorknob, holding the panel shut from the outside. I untied it. The stairs came down and the smell came down with them, heat and something stale, and I went up. The attic was finished enough to stand in near the center. There was pink insulation along the slopes and a single bulb hanging from a wire, no switch, the kind you twist on. I twisted it. Emma was in the far corner on a folded moving blanket. She had her knees pulled to her chest, same as her brother, and her eyes were closed, and for 1 second, 1 long, terrible second, I thought something I will not say out loud. And then she heard me, and her eyes opened, and she saw me, and her mouth opened, and she said, "Grandpa?" in a voice so small and cracked that it will live inside me for the rest of my life. I crossed the attic in 4 steps, and I gathered her up, and she was burning with heat, and she grabbed my shirt with both hands, and she didn't cry. That was the thing that broke me. She didn't cry. She was 7 years old, and she had been up in that attic for 4 days, and when her grandfather finally came, she didn't cry. She had gone past the place where crying happens. I held her against my chest, and I looked around the attic while I held her, and I was looking for what I knew I would find, or something like it, and I found it on the wooden beam that ran along the near wall at about waist height. Emma had been scratching marks into the wood with what I later found was a bent staple she'd pulled from a cardboard box. Tally marks. 4 groups of 4 marks and then 1 more, 4 days and 1 morning. And underneath the tally marks, scratched in uneven, careful letters, her name, EMMA. And underneath her name, 4 words that I photographed before I carried her down the stairs, 4 words that I have photographed and printed and put in a frame. And I look at them sometimes when I need to remind myself why everything that came after was worth it. The word said, "Dad, come get me." She didn't know her dad was 8,000 miles away. She was 7. She believed that if she scratched the right words into wood, her father would find them. I carried her down the stairs. Tyler was standing in the hallway. He had not stayed by the garage like I'd told him, and when he saw his sister, he made a sound that I know will stay with me. He crossed the hallway and hugged her while I was still holding her, and the 3 of us stood there for a moment, the dispatcher still talking in my ear from the phone in my pocket. We were out of the house and standing in the driveway when the first patrol car turned onto the street. 2 more followed. Then a third. What happened next was not peaceful, and it was not quiet. Rebecca came out the front door when she saw the lights, and she was saying my name, and she was saying there had been a misunderstanding, and she was reaching toward Emma, and I stepped between them with something in my posture that made her stop. Craig came out behind her, and he looked at me and at the officers getting out of their cars, and he made the calculation that men like him make in moments like that, and he turned back toward the house. An officer put a hand on his shoulder before he made it 2 steps. I sat on the back bumper of an ambulance with my grandchildren for the next 2 hours. The paramedics checked them both. Tyler's wrists were documented. Emma was dehydrated and had a low-grade fever and was treated on scene and transported to a hospital where she spent 1 night. Tyler sat next to me and watched everything happening to his house with the same quiet, measuring expression he'd been wearing for months, and I understood now what he had been carrying. He had known. He had been sneaking food up to his sister through a hole in the ceiling. 10 years old. He had been doing that alone. I called my son's commanding officer that night. I don't know exactly how the Army handles these things, but within 36 hours, my son was on emergency leave and on a plane home. He landed Sunday night. He came straight from the airport to the hospital. I was in the hallway outside Emma's room when he came through the doors, and I watched my son, who is not a man who cries, stop in the middle of a hospital corridor and put his hands over his face, and I walked to him and put my arms around him, and we stood there together, and I thought about all the things you can't protect your children from, even when you love them as much as it is possible to love anything. Rebecca was arrested Saturday night before I left the scene. Craig was arrested, attempting to leave through the backyard. In the weeks that followed, the case built quickly. The photographs I had taken, the documentation, the testimony Tyler gave to investigators with a calm and precision that stunned every adult in the room. Emma's tally marks on the attic beam were photographed and preserved as evidence. The pediatric examiner's report documented not just this incident, but older injuries. Healing bruises in various stages. Evidence that the attic had been used this way before. There had been a prior incident with the garage. Tyler confirmed it. Craig had been in the house for 5 months. This had been happening for at least 3 of them. I think about that a lot. 3 months. I had been picking those children up every other weekend and delivering them back, and it had been happening for 3 months, and I had not known. I want to be clear that I hold myself accountable for that, even though the attorneys and the investigators and my son have all told me there was no way to see it. Rebecca made sure I never came inside. She brought the kids to the car. She controlled the handoffs. I accepted that because it was easier and because I did not want conflict. And I will carry the weight of that acceptance for the rest of my life. What I will not do is let it stop me from trusting my gut next time. What I will not do is let someone manage my access to my grandchildren and call it normal. The trial happened 8 months later. I sat in that courtroom every single day. Craig received 40 years. The prosecutor pushed for the maximum, and the judge agreed. Rebecca received 22 years. Her attorney argued that Craig was the primary actor, that Rebecca was a woman under the influence of a controlling man. The jury disagreed with all of it. I watched them come back into that courtroom, and I watched the forewoman read the verdict, and I felt something I don't have a perfect word for. It wasn't satisfaction exactly. It wasn't relief. It was more like the feeling when a structure finally settles. When everything stops shifting. When the thing that was wrong is named. I have heard, through people who know people, that Craig's time in prison has not been easy. That information came to me indirectly, through a retired corrections officer who lives down the street from me and who heard about the case. He told me without my asking, the way people tell you things they believe you deserve to know. He told me that men who harm children have a particular experience in closed facilities. That the other men there, men who have done terrible things themselves, draw a line. That Craig had been confined largely to his cell for his own protection. I thought about Emma's tally marks when I heard that. I thought about her counting the days with a bent staple in a hot attic, waiting for her father to find her. And I thought that whatever Craig was experiencing, it was a fraction of what she experienced, and that fractions were still better than nothing. My grandchildren live with my son now. He resigned his commission when his enlistment was up. He said he was done choosing between his country and his children, and I told him I understood, and he said he knew I did. We don't live in the same city, but we're 40 minutes apart now, which is close enough for Sunday dinners and close enough for Emma to call me every week. She calls on Sundays. She doesn't always have a lot to say. Sometimes she just wants to tell me about her week, her friends, the book she's reading, the song she can't get out of her head. Sometimes she asks me those big questions, the ones that come from nowhere. Last Sunday, she asked me whether I thought trees could be lonely. I told her I didn't think so. I told her trees grow in forests, and forests are full of roots all tangled together underground, so that even when you can't see the connection from where you're standing, it's there. She thought about that for a second, and then she said, "I think that's why you came that night, Grandpa, because of the roots. I'm 63 years old. I have poured concrete and framed walls and built things that I hope will stand after I'm gone. I have buried a wife and sent a son to war and made enough mistakes for 3 lifetimes. I know what it is to feel helpless in the face of something you cannot fix. But that night, I drove to a house when something told me to drive. I threw a bolt on a door. I climbed a set of stairs, and I found my granddaughter in the dark, waiting, with her father's name scratched into the wood. She wasn't wrong about the roots.